Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for our online event presented by the G.K. Chesterton Institute for Faith and Culture at Seton Hall University in collaboration with the Society of G.K. Chesterton. The topic of our meeting today is Chesterton's Conversion, a Centenary Conversation. It will be a conversation with Dale Ahlquist, President of the Society of G.K. Chesterton, and Dr. Dermot Quinn, Professor of History and Editor of the Chesterton Review. This year marks the 100th anniversary of Chesterton's reception into the Roman Catholic Church. Conversion was one of the most important events in Chesterton's life. It was also significant in the life of the Church itself, giving Catholics cause for celebration and encouraging other people to consider taking the same step. In fact, 100 years later, Chesterton is still helping men and women to become Catholics. In the words of Dale Ahlquist, one of the world's leading Chestertonians and himself a Chesterton convert, quote, "People who encounter his writings are drawn to his faith. They want what he has," end of quote. In 1929, 5 years after his conversion, he wrote The Catholic Church and Conversion. In it, he writes, quote, "The church is a house with 100 gates, and no two men enter at the same angle." And also writes, quote, "To become a Catholic is not to leave off thinking, but to learn how to think," end of quote. In this online conference, Dermot Quinn and Dale Ahlquist will explore Chesterton's conversion in its personal and historical context, exploring its meaning for him and for the Catholic world in general. What lessons can be drawn from it? How does it resonate today? Are we still living in some sense in the age of Chesterton? It is now with great pleasure that I will introduce to you our two speakers. Our friend and guest, Dale Ahlquist, is president of the Society of Gilbert Keith Chesterton, creator and host of the EWTN series G.K. Chesterton, the Apostle of Common Sense, and publisher and editor of Gilbert Magazine. He is the author of 6 books and has edited 15. After helping start the first Chesterton Academy, a top-rated Catholic classical high school in Minnesota, 15 years ago, he is now the head of the growing Chesterton Schools Network, which now includes over 50 high schools in 5 countries. Welcome. And Dr. Dermot Quinn, he is professor of history at Seton Hall University and editor of the Chesterton Review. He was educated at Trinity College Dublin and New College Oxford, where he was awarded a doctorate in 1986. He has written extensively on Chestertonian themes, has authored 3 books, and has written many articles and reviews in the field of British and Irish history. Welcome, Dr. Quinn. Today's event will include remarks by both Dr. Quinn and Dale Ahlquist. Dr. Quinn will refer to the conversion and the reflections on conversion stories, and Dale Ahlquist will talk about the ripple effect of Chesterton conversion. This will be followed by a conversation. After the conversation segment, we will have a short Q&A period. If you have any questions, please post them in the chat function. If, due to time, we're not able to answer your question, please send them by email to chestertoninstitute@shu, indicating who the question is directed to, one or both of our today's speakers, and we will be able to send you their reply. I now leave you with our speakers, Dr. Dermot Quinn and Dale Ahlquist. Welcome, and Dr. Quinn, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Gloria, for those very kind words of welcome and introduction. And let me reiterate and emphasize again your generous words to Dale, who is indeed one of the world's leading Chestertonians, and it's so marvelous to sit down with him, albeit at a bit of a distance, to have a conversation. And this is the inaugural online conference of the academic year. So it's great to inaugurate the year with such a really, really distinguished Chestertonian, and I hope it's the first of many conversations that Dale and I can have. And what I'm going to do is give a sort of a little potted account of Chesterton's conversion and and offer some reflections on its significance, and then I'll hand it over to Dale, and he will, as Gloria says, give some sense of the, as it were, the ripple effect of Chesterton's conversion, and after that we'll have maybe a bit of a back and forth about the whole thing. So G.K. Chesterton was one of the most famous Catholic converts of the 20th century, and he was also one of the slowest. I have thought this out for myself, and not in a hurry of feeling. He wrote to his mother in August 1922, shortly after coming into the church, "I believe it is the truth." Well, in so writing, he acknowledged the end of a complicated journey that began years before, when, first as a Unitarian, then a pagan, then an agnostic, then a Christian, then an Anglo-Catholic, then finally as a Roman Catholic, he embarked upon the kind of spiritual wandering that he frequently satirized in his own writings. "You could fluster Gilbert, but not hustle him," said Father John O'Connor, recognizing that whatever Chesterton did, he took his time about it. As early as 1903, critics had spoken of Mr. Chesterton's conversion, and the phrase was repeated in 1908, with many people thinking that long before he became a Catholic, he was one already. But decades passed before his conversion took final form. In the meantime, Chesterton ushered others towards the church as he remained outside it. Publishing Heretics in 1905, Orthodoxy in 1908, and the first of the Father Brown stories in 1910, he made the case for Christian belief and Roman Catholicism so convincingly that eventually he convinced himself of it. "I have come to see in the complete Catholic view much deeper truths," he conceded, speaking of his final conversion, as he often did, as moving from a smaller to a larger room, to a place of real freedom. He never regretted a decision that was a long time in coming. Well, shortly after becoming a Catholic, Chesterton proposed a typology of conversion, which suggests some reasons for this hesitancy. The convert, he claimed, commonly passes through 3 stages before making his or her decision. The first is a period of exploration, when he tries to be fair to the church. The second is a period of excitement, when he discovers and appropriates its richness for himself. The third is alarm, when he is, as he said, filled with a sort of fear, feeling like a fool who has been patronizing popery, when he ought to have been awakened to the reality of Rome. That last stage, to quote Dr. Johnson in another context, is when it is time to be in earnest, and it is the hardest moment of all. Before becoming a Catholic, Chesterton experienced this third stage with particular force. He had to join, as it were, the side that he was already on, a decision that came at a very difficult time for him. Along with his usual writing obligations, he had to deal with the death of his father, which took him by surprise, the financial crisis of New Witness, which upset him, the move to Top Meadow in Beaconsfield, which was chaotic, and his wife's possible reaction to his becoming a Catholic, which worried him. His last days as an Anglo-Catholic were anguished, and I now quote Chesterton, "I am not troubled by a great fat man who appears on platforms and in caricatures, even when he enjoys controversies on what I believe to be the right side. I am concerned about what has become of a little boy, whose father showed him a toy theatre, and a schoolboy whom nobody ever heard of, with his brooding on doubts and dirt and daydreams of crude conscientiousness, so inconsistent as to be near to hypocrisy, and in all the morbid life of the lonely mind of a living person with whom I have lived. It is a story that so often came near to ending badly that I want to end well. Well, relief for these anxieties came in the form of advice from Father Ronald Knox, to whom he confided them, support from Father John O'Connor, who came to see him in Beaconsfield, and I think above all, in the assurance that Frances Chesterton would welcome her husband's conversion as a conclusion to 3 months that had been exceptionally trying for both of them. I should be only too glad to come with him, she told Father O'Connor, if God in his mercy should show the way clear. And thereafter, with that kind of wifely permission, thereafter it was only a matter of formal instruction, which consisted of a day reading the Penny Catechism, a kind of pathetic and yet somehow appropriate coda, as if the little boy inside the large man were still seeking answers to the puzzles of the world. The reception itself was prosaic, taking place in Beaconsfield on July the 30th, 1922, in a kind of shed with corrugated iron roof and wooden walls, a part of the Railway Hotel. Dale is going to show us a few pictures of the Railway Hotel in a few minutes. So it was, as he said, a kind of shed with corrugated iron roof, a part of the Railway Hotel. Father O'Connor officiated, joined by Father Ignatius Rice, and Dale will show us a picture of Father Rice as well, who came from Douay Abbey for the day. And afterwards, the party went for afternoon tea, with Frances crying tears of happiness and Gilbert penning a famous poem, and I will read you the 4 most famous lines of that poem. They rattle reason out through many a sieve that stores the sand and lets the gold go free. And all these things are less than dust to me, because my name is Lazarus and I live. My Name is Lazarus is the title of a wonderful book that Dale has edited. In fact, here it is. My Name is Lazarus, and Dale will certainly help us understand that book in a few minutes' time. So he had become a Catholic, Chesterton said, to have his sins forgiven. It was one of the reasons that had drawn him to Christianity, what he called the religion of repentance, in the first place. It is not, as he said, morbid to confess your sins. The morbid thing is not to confess them. Entire societies, he thought, died because they refused to be honest with themselves. So this emphasis on self-knowledge and honest is very, very important to Chesterton, both individually and, as it were, in society at large. The fear that once tormented Chesterton, the danger of being trapped inside his own head, was answered by a church that seemed to know his head better than he knew it himself. Conversion meant that he was never alone again. In another sense, though, conversion also meant that he was never left alone. I didn't want to talk to anybody about it, as though it were a highly important matter, he said to a newspaper reporter a few days afterwards, but I don't mind it being known. I shall probably write about it soon. Well, that I think is one of the great understatements of the 20th century. I shall probably write about it soon. In fact, everybody had an opinion about it. Nothing for years has given me so much joy, Morris Baring wrote on hearing the news. Every day I live, the church seems to me more and more wonderful, the sacraments more and more solemn and sustaining. The voice of the church, her liturgy, her rules, her discipline, her ritual, her decisions in matters of faith and morals, more and more excellent and profoundly wise. That was Morris Baring to Chesterton. Hilaire Belloc envied Chesterton his profound religious emotion, although he admitted that he lacked such emotion himself. Father O'Connor disclaimed responsibility. I had nothing to do with it. Our Lady had him from the start. When he was a boy going to school, his first exercise in verse was a poem in praise of Our Lady. Father O'Connor also told Chesterton that he would do still better work than ever, a prediction vindicated when St. Francis of Assisi appeared in 1923 and The Everlasting Man 2 years later. The first of these books was a kind of Thanksgiving bouquet to the Church. The second, I think, a work of real theological creativity. Chesterton's most ambitious demonstration of the rooting of the history of human activity in psychological reality, and the most valuable single record of the place of the Incarnation in his thinking. By becoming a Catholic, Chesterton insisted, he had not ceased to think. And these books, I think, are very much proof of that idea. To be sure, the skeptics remained skeptical. Arnold Lunn thought that in submitting to papal infallibility, Chesterton had lost his mind. Partly under Chesterton's influence, Lunn later lost his own mind, becoming a Catholic in 1933. Bernard Shaw claimed as he put it, the spectacle of Chesterton going to confession was incredible, monstrous, comic. Catholicism, he said, did not strike on the knowledge box of the modern intellectual, and it is on the modern intellectual that you are depending. Obviously, Shaw hadn't read closely enough what Chesterton thought about modern intellectuals. H.G. Wells conceded that Chesterton conferred on Catholicism a kind of boozy halo. But Wells being Wells, he wanted nothing to do with the booze or the halo. And among the believers, the reaction, I think, was oddly mixed. One Church of England clergyman regretted that, quote, the sparkling paradoxes of the greatest wit of the century were lost to Anglicanism. Chesterton's cast of mind was infallibly drawn to Rome, another clergyman suggested, because it was more historical than logical, which is a curious, not to say, I think, meaningless complaint. On the whole, though, Catholics were elated that, as Father Hugh Kelly put it, Chesterton's brilliant and vigorous modern intelligence had found its way to the Church through a welter of recent philosophies and creeds. Other conversions, Christopher Dawson in 1909, David Jones in 1921, Graham Greene in 1926, Evelyn Waugh in 1930, Arnold Lunn, as I mentioned, in 1933. These other conversions lent plausibility to the notion of a third spring that would complete the unfinished work of the second spring of the previous century. Chesterton represented only one element of a more complicated English Catholic world in the middle years of the 20th century, but his conversion was greeted with almost unanimous pleasure by a culturally besieged but vocal community. And mention of this third spring, and with it, of course, an echo of the second spring, suggests a parallel with Newman. And I think these parallels are worth pondering for a moment or two. William Blissett, great Chesterton scholar, who, by the way, celebrated his 101st birthday just a few weeks ago, William Blissett has suggested that Chesterton represents a kind of bridge between earlier and later generations of converts, a figure who connects Victorian Oxford and Edwardian and Georgian London. Chesterton himself acknowledged his debt to Newman, whose thought he knew intimately and whose writings he could quote from memory. But there were differences as well as similarities. Consider, for example, how each man set the scene for his conversion. In 1852, 7 years after becoming a Catholic, Newman delivered his second spring sermon at St. Mary's College, Oscott, in which he spoke of, quote, the utter contempt into which Roman Catholicism had fallen in England in the years before the 1830s. Quote, here's the second spring sermon. Such were the Catholics of England, found in corners and alleys and cellars and the housetops, or in the recesses of the country, cut off from the populous world around them, and dimly seen, as if through a mist or in twilight, as ghosts flitting to and fro by the high Protestants, the lords of the earth. At length so feeble did they become, so utterly contemptible, that contempt gave birth to pity. And the more generous of their tyrants actually began to wish to bestow on them some favour, under the notion that their opinions were simply too absurd ever to spread again, and that they themselves were they but raised in civil importance, would soon unlearn and be ashamed of them. And thus, out of mere kindness to us, they began to vilify our doctrines to the Protestant world, so that our very idiocy or our secret unbelief might be our plea for mercy. That's kind of a powerful passage from the second spring sermon, in which Newman talks about the utter contempt into which Catholicism had fallen in the England of his growing up. And Chesterton, describing the late Victorian world, sort of kind of in some ways a rather similar note. Every man, I quote Chesterton, every man conceives himself as moving in a cosmos of some kind. And the man of the days of my youth walked about in a kind of vast and airy crystal palace, in which there were exhibits set side by side. Our attention was fixed on the exhibits, which were all carefully ticketed and arranged, for it was an age of science. Here stood all the religions in a row, the churches or sects or whatever we called them, and towards the end of the row there was a particularly dingy and dismal one, with a pointed roof half fallen in and pointed windows most broken with stones by passers-by. And we were told that this particular exhibit was the Roman Catholic Church. Some of us were sorry for it, and even fancied it had been rather badly used. A few of us even pointed out that many details in the ruin were artistically beautiful or architecturally important. But most people preferred to deal at other and more businesslike booths, at the Quaker shop of Peace and Plenty, or the Salvation Army store, where the showman beats the big drum outside. So there's Chesterton, and before him Newman, and the point I think is fairly obvious, that social and intellectual isolation formed the background to both conversions. At this point, however, differences emerge. In describing the mid-Victorian conversions, of which his own was the most notable, Newman conveyed a church that was militant, suffering, and triumphant all at once. I quote Newman again. One thing I am sure of, that the more the enemy rages against us, so much more will the saints in heaven plead for us. The more fearful are our trials from the world, the more present to us will be our Mother Mary. The more malicious are the devices of men against us, the louder cry of supplication will ascend from the bosom of the whole church to God for us. Who is to make you fear? What is to startle you? Who is to seduce you? Who is to stop you, whether you are to suffer or to do, whether to lay the foundations of the church in tears or to put the crown upon the work in jubilation? So there's Newman, as I say, the church militant, suffering, and triumphant all at once. But Chesterton seems to me was more interested in a theology of welcome than of repudiation. And here's Chesterton again. It's basically a continuation of the passage I read a few moments ago. Now, conversion consists very largely on the intellectual side in the discovery that all the picture of equal creeds inside an indifferent cosmos is quite false. You know, this kind of crystal palace of different sects. It is not a question of comparing the merits and defects of the Quaker meeting house set beside the Catholic cathedral. It is the Quaker meeting house that is inside the Catholic cathedral. It is the Catholic cathedral that covers everything like the vault of the Crystal Palace. And it is when we look up at the vast, distant dome covering all the exhibits that we trace the Gothic roof and the pointed windows. In other words, and I continue to quote Chesterton, in other words, Quakerism is but a temporary form of quietism, which has arisen technically outside the church as the quietism of Fenelon appeared technically inside the church. But both were in themselves temporary and would have, like Fenelon, sooner or later to return to the church in order to live. A Calvinist is a Catholic obsessed with the Catholic idea of the sovereignty of God. In point of fact, he is a diseased Catholic. And the disease left to itself would be death or madness. But every step he takes back towards humanity is a step back towards Catholicism. End of quotation. So in his insistence that the church was bigger on the inside than the outside, that it was ample and spacious, balanced and contained, that it had room for everyone, Chesterton saw conversion as a form of spiritual and intellectual completion. He argued the Christian case in a Christian way, generously, charitably, with the doors of the church wide open. And I think the extent of Chesterton's own religious wanderings gives a kind of heft to this theology of welcome. Who was he to find fault with anyone else's spiritual autobiography? What heresy had he not tried for himself at one time or another? Paganism had appealed to him as a teenager, the way it understood, as he put it, the mystery of trees and waters and the holy flame, its kindly but careless gods, its hankering for sacred substances and sacramental acts. But paganism was a dead end. We believe so much less than that, and we desire so much more, he said. And the alternatives to it were no better, and in some cases worse. Agnosticism was an admission of defeat. Skepticism was the thought that killed thought. Unitarianism respected Jesus the teacher, but rejected Jesus the Christ. Pantheism was a priggish, as he put it, a priggish pretense that all things are equally divine. Only Christianity answered what he called his blind hunger for normality, the need to recognize the reality of sin and the fact of redemption, and the need, equally great, not to be left alone in a solipsistic universe of his own creation. Well, the story of Chesterton's discovery of orthodoxy need not be retold this afternoon, but I think his most famous description of it is worth quoting as a kind of an anticipation of his reception into the church. And I quote Chesterton again. And then followed an experience impossible to describe. It was as if I had been blundering about since my birth with two huge and unmanageable machines of different shapes and without apparent connection, the world and the Christian tradition. I had found this hole in the world, the fact that one must find a way of loving the world without trusting it. Somehow one must love the world without being worldly. I found this projecting spike of Christian theology, like a sort of hard spike, the dogmatic insistence that God was personal and had made a world separate from himself. The spike of dogma fitted exactly into the whole of the world. It had evidently meant to go there. And then the strange thing began to happen. When once these two parts of the two machines came together, one after another, all the other parts fell in with an eerie exactitude. I could hear bolt after bolt over all the machinery falling into its place with a kind of click of relief. End of quotation from Orthodoxy. The completion promised by Orthodoxy was perfected by Roman Catholicism. Other forms of Orthodox belief were destructive or decadent, being, as Chesterton put it, either lies and libels about Catholicism or a series of steps away from their own roots. Chesterton, for example, noticed that Protestants who complained that Catholics did not believe the Bible excitedly discovered that they did not believe it themselves. Even High Anglicanism was a via negativa. Even when he is defending orthodoxy, as he so often seems, this is a quotation from Chesterton, even when he is defending orthodoxy, as he so often seems, the Anglo-Catholic is only defending it on certain points against certain fallacies. But the fallacies are merely fashions, and the next fashion will be quite different. And then his orthodoxy will be old-fashioned, in other words, Anglo-Catholicism, but not ours. End of quotation. Christianity was larger than paganism, and Roman Catholicism was larger than other Christian denominations. It was larger because it contained, corrected, and completed them. And that is why Chesterton, after a very long journey, became a Catholic. Everything fell into place with a kind of click of relief. And that click of relief felt by Chesterton has been felt by many others. People enter the church, Belloc wrote, by every conceivable gate, after every conceivable process of slow intellectual examination, of shock, of vision, of moral trial. And one of those gates is Chesterton himself. Among the large number of people he has brought to the church are, to name only some well-known figures, Marshall McLuhan, Graham Greene, Alec Guinness, Oral Colney, Sigrid Undset, Walter Hooper, William Oddy, Peter Geach, Elizabeth Anscombe, Stratford Caldecott, Ross Dothate, and Joseph Pearce. Graham Greene ranked Orthodoxy, The Thing, and The Everlasting Man as among the great books of the age. Elizabeth Anscombe spent a teenage summer reading book after book by Chesterton, including The Everlasting Man, after which it came to me that I believed in God and ought to pray. And she then looked for a priest. Sigrid Undset said of The Everlasting Man, "This is the greatest book ever written. It has to be translated into Norwegian." And she translated it. "I know every word of Chesterton," said Marshall McLuhan. "He is responsible for bringing me into the church." Peter Geach placed Chesterton alongside St. Thomas More, Thomas Hobbes, Samuel Johnson, and William Cobbett in, quote, "a galaxy of fine old eccentrics who wrote so well." Oral Colney was, like so many other converts of my time, won for Catholicism largely, if not chiefly, by the wisdom and wit of Gilbert Keith Chesterton. And examples need not be multiplied beyond necessity. And our guest this morning, Dale Ahlquist, is himself a distinguished Chestertonian convert, a man who, by the way, said that his honeymoon was ruined by Chesterton. Maybe he'll explain that to us. And Dale has performed a really conspicuous service by gathering the testimonials of other converts into the fine book called My Name is Lazarus. And in it, he chronicles what he has called this ripple of conversions that continue nearly 90 years after Chesterton's death. So I think what I will do now is hand over to Dale, who can, as it were, explain to us this ripple of conversions, which I think is in fact almost more of a tsunami of conversions. And when Dale has given us some thoughts, then we can have a conversation. So Dale, thank you once again for joining us, and it's great to have the benefit of your really profound knowledge of Chesterton and his conversion.
Thank you, Dermot, and thank you, Gloria, both of you, for inviting me to participate in this online seminar. It's a great pleasure to be with you today, and it's a great topic as well. I just have to start probably though by correcting Dermot on one thing. I never said that Chesterton ruined my honeymoon. It's the fact is that's when I started reading Chesterton was on my honeymoon. You can ask my wife if the honeymoon was ruined or not, but we had a very colorful honeymoon. I was reading The Everlasting Man, and she was reading Les Miserables. But what makes the story even more interesting is that we were, a couple of non-Catholics honeymooning in Rome, as all good Baptists go to Rome on their honeymoon, and we were there the day that Pope John Paul II was shot. So we really had a momentous beginning. But as I say to others, I've been married to Chesterton as long as I've been married to my wife, and as she graciously says, the three of us have gotten along very well. But this idea of the ripple effect of Chesterton's conversion, Dermot has set up my remarks, I think, perfectly. In fact, he's said things that I don't need to say now, so I can shorten my talk. I'm very grateful always for that. But I think we should probably mention, first of all, the thing that Dermot was actually saying we weren't going to talk about, which is his conversion to Christianity, as he describes in Orthodoxy, because that's certainly part of his conversion process. In fact, he later said that his conversion to Christianity was only his incomplete conversion to Catholicism. But the book Orthodoxy, when you read it, it's hard to believe that it's not written by a Catholic. I challenge my students when I teach the book, if they could find anything in the book that indicates that Chesterton is not Catholic. I think there's maybe only one line, and even that one's ambiguous. But for the most part, he's defending the Catholic faith. He's defending the Apostles' Creed. And he certainly doesn't have very complimentary things to say about John Calvin and Calvinism and much of Protestantism. And yet Protestants are drawn to this book. I was an evangelical Baptist when I read the book and just was brought into it completely, and never found anything that Catholic in it for me, for my purposes, when I was reading it. But of course, I was able to see past all those things when I was first reading Chesterton. But for Chesterton, his choice in becoming a Christian came down to a choice between sanity and insanity, as he describes it. And sanity means free will. It means responsibility. And that's the thing that he praises and embraces so much in embracing the Christian faith. But the book was written 14 years before he became a Catholic. And after he became a Catholic, 14 years later, he died. He was only a Catholic for 14 years. And he died, by the way, on June 14th. And by the way, I was born on June 14th. So that 14 theme is just plowing right along there. I think for Chesterton and for all others who have followed him to Rome, who've gone through the conversion experience, they realize that conversion is both a public and a private affair. there's the universal part, which was the universal part, and there's the personal part. The former's the rational part, the reasonable, really not that difficult to convey. But the latter is the emotional part. It's conveyed in different ways and is sometimes very difficult to convey. But the problem is you can't separate the two. They are both present at once. Chesterton says that religion is a secret passion audaciously made public. And when it comes to confronting the Catholic faith, he says, it's not really a question of what a man is made to believe, but what he must believe, what he cannot help believing. He cannot disbelieve in an elephant when he has seen one, and he cannot treat the church as a child when he has discovered that she is his mother. It's a great line from the Catholic Church in Conversion. Well, let's talk a little bit about the day itself. We can show the first slide, or slide number 2, which is a picture of Chesterton and his wife Frances at the time of the conversion. If you want to put that slide up. Is it, there we go. So that's Gilbert and Frances, about 1921-22. That's the way they looked when Chesterton was received into the church. If you want to show the next slide, that will be Father O'Connor and G.K. Chesterton. Father O'Connor, of course, the inspiration for the Father Brown character, a friend of Chesterton's since about 1902, and came to Chesterton as an admirer of his writing, and really turned into a spiritual counselor. And I have to add, he was also Francis Chesterton's spiritual counselor for years before they were received into the church. In fact, Frances probably met with Father O'Connor more than Gilbert did. She just absolutely relied on his spiritual counsel. And then the next slide shows Dom Ignatius Rice, who was the other priest present that day. That day was July 30th, 1922. The next slide shows the railroad station in Beaconsfield. And at the top of the hill there, right in the center, is the Railway Hotel. So you can see that why it was called the Railway Hotel, obviously, because it's the hotel that served the train stop in Beaconsfield. The next slide shows the exterior of the Railway Hotel. And then the next slide shows the hotel, but in the very back there to the far right, that is the shed, the auxiliary building attached to the hotel. It was just used for gatherings of sort. But the owners of the hotel, Mr. and Mrs. Borlase, they were Catholic, and they made that space available so that what became the Catholic Church in Beaconsfield could meet there for several years until the church was built. This picture, by the way, was taken in the 1930s after the Mr. and Mrs. Borlase died, and the hotel was changed. The name was changed to the Earl of Beaconsfield Hotel. That's why it says that on it. But that shows the building. As far as I know, it's one of the only pictures we have of the shed. Somewhere I have an interior picture of what the church looked like, but I could not find it, and I do apologize for that. And I think that's the last of our pictures. I think there's no others. So yeah, that's just the front of the book from its first edition. So there were no pictures taken that day. It was a very Dermot described it as not a conspicuous occasion at all, and it didn't qualify as news, as it were, because Father O'Connor and Father Rice, as they were walking away, and the only thing that happened was that they had Chesterton had made his first confession and made a profession of faith. That was his reception into the Catholic Church. He didn't receive communion till a few months later, after he went through confirmation, which was actually in the next town of High Wycombe. So when the two priests were walking away, they just made a vow to each other not to tell anybody about about the ceremony, because they wanted to see how long it would take for the press to find out. And the answer is it took 3 weeks. So the first time it was made public was some 3 weeks after Chesterton was received in the church. And then it was big news when it was finally reported. Except, as Dermot already pointed out, it wasn't big news for many people, because if it was news at all, they were surprised to hear that Chesterton had just become Catholic. So many people already thought he was. He'd already written 24 Father Brown stories. He'd been defending the Catholic Church for years. As early as 1903, he said the church will always be attacked because it's Catholic, and it will always be defended because it's Catholic. But then there were the people who were genuinely shocked because they knew Chesterton was not Catholic, and they thought that would never happen. And Dermot made a reference to George Bernard Shaw, who'd always made fun of what he called Chesterton's Roman Catholic hobby. But when he heard that Chesterton had actually been received into the church, he fired off a letter to him saying, "Gilbert, this is going too far." And then Belloc never thought it would happen. Never. And he said, he wrote, "I never thought it was possible." So that is really quite something. Then the reaction in the Church of England, that ran the gamut. The local vicar in Beaconsfield said, "I'm glad to hear that Chesterton's going over to Rome. He was never a very good Anglican." And then, of course, there were the Anglicans who were genuinely upset about it. They said, we've lost really one of the most greatest intellects of our time to the Roman Church, because we did such a bad job of keeping him. And these writers were specifically lamenting how liberal the Anglican Church was becoming, and how its doctrine was slipping away, its Christian doctrine. And he said that they were driving away the educated laity, and that the growing liberalism in the Church of England had never attracted one educated man to the church, but in the meantime it had robbed that church of the genius of G.K. Chesterton. But the London Tablet just crowed the news. They were very thrilled to hear that Chesterton had become Catholic, and they immediately were comparing the conversion with that of Newman. And of course, as Chesterton, he was asked why he became Catholic, and his first one was to get rid of my sins. That was the quick answer. But he also said, he also thanked the Anglican Church for driving him away. He said that was one of the main reasons. He said, I have the Anglican Church to thank for my conversion. He said, as long as I believed that that the Anglican Church was part of the Catholic Church, I could remain. But if I ever thought it was a Protestant church, I would never remain in it. And he no longer saw it as a direct descendant of the Catholic Church. And also, he specifically pointed out that the Anglican Church was not acting with any authority on the great issues of the day. The issue foremost in Chesterton's mind was that of contraception. And with the Anglican Church not being able to speak with any authority on that, Chesterton said, they're just like another Protestant church in utter bewilderment about this very primary moral question. And this is 100 years ago. 100 years ago, he's already talking about contraception. He says, when the bishops no longer condemned a practice that had always been condemned by all Christian churches, they became champions of a low and poisonous trick not far removed from infanticide. And he said their position was essentially heathenism. And they were speaking with no unity, no authority, and they could not denounce immorality. It's kind of interesting. That's one aspect of Chesterton's conversion that we don't hear much about. And when he made the decision, he wrote a letter to his mother to try to explain what he was about to do, and he said, I'm going to do what Cecil did, which is his brother who died at the end of World War I, who preceded him into the Catholic Church. And he said, I'm convinced that the fight for the family and for personal liberty and for everything decent must now be conducted by the one fighting form of Christianity, Catholic Church. He was accused and dismissed by some people as just having a very romantic attachment to a love of ritual and the aesthetics of the High Middle Ages with its Gothic cathedrals reaching to the heavens. But in a letter that he wrote to a man named Bertram Hyde, who had raised these very concerns and asked him really why he became Catholic, Chesterton responded, I ought to say that first, saving the grace of God, my own conversion to Catholicism was entirely rational and certainly not at all ritualistic. I was received in a tin shed at the back of a railway hotel. I accepted it because it did afford conviction to my analytical mind. But people could see the ritual and are seldom allowed to hear anything of the philosophy. About the ritual, I think the truest thing that was said by Yeats, the poet, certainly not a Catholic and even a Christian, that ceremony goes with innocence. Children are not ashamed of dressing up, nor great poets at great periods, as Petrarch wore the laurel. Our world does feel something of what Wells says, because our world is as nervous and irritable as Wells himself. But I think the children and the poets are more permanent. Well, 3 years later, Bertram Hyde, to whom Chesterton wrote that letter, was received into the Catholic Church. And Dermot just gave us a wonderful list of some historical converts whose conversion absolutely was connected to Chesterton. I think one of the ones that and some of them became Catholic before Chesterton, and yet they attributed their conversion to reading Chesterton, which shows how Orthodoxy was such a Catholic book written by a pre-Catholic. And another one of those converts is Monsignor Ronald Knox, who, in an inside-out way, was one who Chesterton talked to when Chesterton was ready to be received into the church. He talked with Knox before he really took instruction from Father O'Connor, and Dermot makes a reference to the penny catechism, which was the most of what his instruction was. And Chesterton says that when he read the penny catechism, he came across one sentence that just summed up everything he'd been trying to do in his entire career, when he read that the two sins against hope are presumption and despair. And Chesterton said he was writing that the two sins against hope describe the optimist and the pessimist, who Chesterton was really doing war with in all of his writings. The optimist who thinks that everything is good except the pessimist, and the pessimist who thinks everything's bad except himself. They're both enemies of free will and of not facing reality. Chesterton is really a writer of true hope, and that's interesting that line is one of the things that just jumped out of him from the penny catechism, just affirming that he was doing the right thing by becoming Catholic. I think another interesting convert to mention is a novelist who is not well known, but I think she's going to probably undergo a revival of interest. That's Sheila K. Smith. She was an Anglo-Catholic as well, and when Chesterton converted, she became kind of the leading intellectual who was a Anglo-Catholic, and she was the go-to person on all Anglo-Catholic issues. And I think in some ways she found too much pressure being the spokesman for Anglo-Catholicism. I think that helped propel her closer to the Catholic Church, because she eventually converted as well. I love the Arnold Lund story, who'd written a whole book about Roman converts and ends up becoming one himself after he criticizes them all, and attributes his conversion to Chesterton. The iconic actor Alec Guinness, Chesterton played a role in his conversion because Alec Guinness played Father Brown, and it was that experience that helped make him appreciate the Catholic Church. He was also familiar with Chesterton's writings. E.F. Schumacher of Small is Beautiful fame, his conversion he attributed to Chesterton. The Jewish author G.B. Stern was a great admirer of Chesterton, who also he paved her way to the Catholic Church. Shane Leslie, cousin of Winston Churchill, diplomat. The author, poet Theodore Maynard, he said the effect of Chesterton's orthodoxy has been enormously powerful upon the young men of this generation. For one of these men I can speak. I was sliding at the age of 19 from the Calvinist theology in which I had been brought up into a vague humanitarian skepticism when I read Orthodoxy, and that book began in me a reaction which, by the grace of God, 3 years later carried me into the Catholic Church. Again, 3 years later, that means that was 11 years before Chesterton became Catholic. I mentioned how the Catholic press was very happy about Chesterton's conversion, but they were also a little worried. They were worried that Chesterton somehow would not be the same writer he was in his pre-Catholic writing. And they needn't have worried because Chesterton really doesn't write any differently at all after his conversion. In fact, it's a fun challenge to just take a random piece of his writing and try to date it. You almost cannot. It could be at any place in his career for the most part. He's a whole thinker so early in his career to the later part of his career. It's very difficult to date his writing unless you have some clue about a particular event he might be referring to. And again, he was writing already against Protestants before his conversion, as he wrote against the Calvinists. But I think certainly in his book on Thomas Aquinas, he does unleash on Luther in that book in a way that I think probably he might not have before his conversion. I can't say, but his most specific writing about Luther comes after his conversion. And I think it's one of the main interesting themes about that book is that the Protestant Reformation really came about in Chesterton's theory as a reaction against Thomas Aquinas and the Platonists reacting against the Aristotelians. Another seminar topic for another day, Dermot. I had the pleasure of putting together this book. My name is Lazarus. It's 34 stories of conversions, and a whole variety of them, from former Muslims, Jews, agnostics, atheists, different Christian cults, and of course all different Christian denominations. All of them found something different that they latched onto in Chesterton that appealed to them and helped bring them into the Catholic Church. And there's the other ripple effect that we should talk about just briefly, and that is C.S. Lewis. The conversion of C.S. Lewis to Christianity is unquestionably the result of reading The Everlasting Man, as Lewis himself admits. He says, a young man who's serious about his atheism cannot be too careful about what he reads. And Lewis himself is a maker of converts, including Catholic converts. Many people come to G.K. Chesterton through C.S. Lewis, and he continues to be a door to the Catholic Church without having entered it himself. And Chesterton even said at one point that he was standing at the door, escorting other people into the Catholic Church without having entered it himself. People ask me, well, why didn't C.S. Lewis become Catholic? And I know the answer. Chesterton gave it to us when writing about William Blake. He just didn't live long enough. He was on his way. Chesterton says you're either moving towards the Catholic Church or you're moving away from it. He says if every man lived 1,000 years, every man's going to become either a nihilistic atheist or a member of the Catholic Church. That's in his book on William Blake, written 10 years before Chesterton became Catholic. And then, as Dermot has alluded, I'm one of the ripple effects of Chesterton's conversion. And, you know, if I had not read Chesterton, in addition to not being sitting here right now and talking about it, I certainly never would have started the first Chesterton Academy. And it's certainly one of the most impactful thing I've ever been involved with. There's now 50 schools around the U.S. and in 4 other countries. 16 more schools are scheduled to open next year. So we'll have over 60 of these Catholic classical high schools. And it's really a grassroots revival of classical learning. And it's an absolute privilege for me to be involved with that. And I thank G.K. Chesterton for making that happen. So I guess I'll just close with something that Father Boyd would always, a line of his that he'd always quote, because when he talked about Chesterton's reference to George MacDonald being a morning star of the reunion, as Luther and Calvin were called the morning stars of the Reformation, he saw Chesterton refers to George MacDonald as a morning star of the reunion, someone who appealed to both Catholics and Protestants alike. There's no question that C.S. Lewis and G.K. Chesterton appeal to both Catholics and Protestants alike. And just as Father Boyd says, they are morning stars of the reunion. Yes, that conversion was a great turning point in the history of the Catholic Church, I think, in 20th century. But I think it's a way of bringing Christians together and not of separating them. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Dale. Thank you, Dr. Quinn, for your remarks and excellent presentations. We have received a few questions from our attendees, and I would like to take a moment to thank everyone for joining us today, their lunchtime, and to be a part of our event. So I have a few questions that I will pose, and either one of you can answer or both of you. So the first one is, what was the reason for the delay in Chesterton's conversion?
Well, I think there's 2 answers to that one. One is the obvious one that everyone always mentions, and it's absolutely true, that he wanted Francis to come into the Catholic Church with him at the same time. They just were attached in everything they did. They did everything together. For him to do something that major without her was too much, I think. But he finally did. It was a great, bold move. But he says something else in his book on the Catholic Church and conversion. He says it should be remembered for the sake of the convert that anything said by an opponent of the Catholic Church will not have any effect at all on the potential convert. But one wrong word from a Catholic can do an enormous amount of harm. And Chesterton would not have said that if he hadn't have had that experience himself. I think the main thing that delayed him from becoming a Catholic was some other Catholics.
Dermot, any comment on your?
No, I think Dale has said that very well. It was a very kind of protracted spiritual journey, and I think his anxiety about Francis was the fundamental problem, but anxiety, and it's almost as if he was kind of afraid to broach the subject, and she was kind of waiting for him to come on, we know what you're going to do, and you have my benediction for doing it, and it was such an enormous relief, I mean, as I said in my few little remarks. this was an enormous, this was she said, an exceptionally trying 3 months for them before he eventually sought reception into the church. And I think for her it was just a huge weight taken from her shoulder. And of course she joined him shortly afterwards. I think, and maybe Dale can say a little about this. Chesterton, on a visit to Italy in 1920, kind of sort of made up his mind. I think finally he was praying in front of a statue of Our Lady in the cathedral in Brindisi, and I think at that point the decision was made. But then, it took another 2 years for that final step. And I think the that last stage, I talked about the 3 stages of conversion. The last stage of kind of running away from the church, trying not to be converted. I think that was very much the case with Chesterton. And I think that is very much the case with a lot of the people that Dale has written about, or whose stories Dale has gathered together in his wonderful book, My Name is Lazarus. The sense that I get from them is that one of the reasons why Chesterton is such an important influence on their conversion is that, so to speak, his story is their story. And his story in particular in that 3rd stage, when they are, as it were, trying not to be converted. This kind of protracted, anxious period of indecision is something which Chesterton felt very deeply, and his example is something which itself becomes a kind of encouragement to conversion. I don't know whether Dale wants to speak about that.
Well, I would add that, having been through those 3 stages myself, there's that comfortable stage, which is the 2nd stage, when you're simply discovering the Catholic Church. You've made no commitment, and he himself says that's the fun part, where you're taking in all these exotic new things, but you can't stay comfortable, because then it comes decision time, and that's the agonizing time, is that 3rd stage. And yeah, I think for Chesterton it was at least that period of 2 years, because he made that decision standing in front of the statue of the Virgin Mary in Brindisi. But yeah, it was still 2 more years of fighting.
Yeah,
Okay, so we'll go to the, we have a few other ones that have been coming in. And the next question is, would you say that Chesterton was the most important convert of the 20th century?
I would say, I don't want to jump in. I would say he's one of the most important converts. I think it's kind of not really a great idea to do a sort of David Letterman top 10 list, because that kind of is not in the spirit of the enterprise. But he was hugely important. I think he's important for all of the reasons that Dale has mentioned, and I've tried to mention as well, because he has brought so many people into the church and kept so many people in the church. I mean, it's the experience of reading, the account of a conversion by a convert that has, as it were, reinforced the faith of a lot of cradle Catholics. So I think he was a very, very important convert. And as Dale said, what Chesterton himself represented, or claimed to represent, is the fighting form of Christianity. I think that sense of intellectual siege that a lot of people of faith have, that the world is against them, that the kind of the great engines of popular influence are basically anti-Christian or anti-Orthodox or anti-religious. Chesterton represents, as he says, the sort of the fighting form of Christianity. He said, you want, as many of Dale's converts have pointed out, you want to be on his side, and I think that capacity to encourage people to be kind of forthright and confident in their belief is one of the reasons why I think he is certainly one of the most important converts of the 20th century. And I'll hand it over to Dale to kind of respond.
I think you could easily argue he's the most important English convert, because he's right. I don't think anyone argues that Newman is not the most important 19th century convert from England, and I think that his mantle was passed to Chesterton in England. But I think other nations boast important converts who had a specific effect on their cultures as well. I mean, certainly one could argue that Dorothy Day might be the most important American convert from the 20th century.
Mhm, mhm. Great, great. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Going to the next one is apart from the fact that they have been inspired by Chesterton, is there anything else that Chesterton converts have in common?
Well, Dale is certainly the expert here, so
Yeah.
I'll hand that over to Dale.
Well, I think that most of them had that similar conversion experience that Chesterton describes, and and even when Chesterton describes himself, he says, "I'm not saying this is true for everybody. This is what it was for me." But when most converts read those three stages, they go, "Yeah, that's what it was for me too." But I will say that we do have quite a variety of people in this book, and I think that's what the most remarkable thing is. They all became Catholic, and Chesterton played a role in their conversion. Certainly, other things did too, but this is a great variety of people because there's all different backgrounds, and I like the fact that they didn't have much else in common.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, maybe I could offer a little thought as well. I mean, I certainly agree with Dale that what strikes you about Chesterton's converts is the variety. In fact, I just if you would sort of indulge me, I just could read out from the back of Dale's book. He lists the contributors and gives little bios of these contributors, and it's almost comic, actually. I mean, I don't mean to be frivolous about something very serious, but here goes. He is a former Baptist. He is a former Presbyterian, Methodist, and Episcopalian. He is a former Jehovah's Witness, a former Marxist, and a former Anglican priest. She is a former evangelical. She is a former atheist. He is a former pagan. She is a former Mennonite. He is a former atheist and a former Episcopalian, although not at the same time, which I think is a very clever joke. He is a former Unitarian. She is a former unbeliever at all levels. He is a former Free Methodist, Nazarene, Emergent Church, and a couple of others. And finally, and I think this is most typically, he is a former just about everything. So if you go to the back of Dale's book, you can see all of these formers. And the extraordinary thing is, as Dale says, the kind of multifariousness of Chesterton's converts. And I think, again, Chesterton, I mean, to adopt Walt Whitman, Chesterton contained multitudes. His own story is a similar story of being a former this, a former that, and a former the other. So what certainly kind of unites Chesterton's converts is that they come from all sorts of different spiritual directions. And in a way, so did Chesterton. The other thing that, as I read Dale's book, and I encourage others who haven't read it to get their hands on it, I mean, what strikes me about these stories is really the intense seriousness of purpose. That these are people who have struggled, who have agonized, who have thought about conversion at a very, very deep spiritual level, and then maybe this is the kind of so obvious a point that it's hardly worth making, but it should be made. The sense of relief and joy and delight in entering the church. In fact, Dale mentioned Ronald Knox a few moments ago. In fact, I mentioned Ronald Knox in my brief remarks. And in fact, if I could quote a little line from Ronald Knox, which I think in some ways is the motto of Chesterton's converts in this book. Here's Father Knox. He said, "I have been overwhelmed with the feeling of liberty, the glorious liberty of the sons of God. It is a freedom from the uncertainty of mind. It was not until I became a Catholic that I became conscious of my former homelessness, my exile from the place that was my own." That's a wonderful remark. My exile from the place that was my own. And I think all of Dale's Chestertonian converts gathered in his marvelous book could echo those remarks of Father Knox, of this glorious feeling of liberty and their exile, now happily relieved, their exile from a place that was their own.
Well said.
Okay, thank you. How about this question? Did Chesterton ever regret becoming a Catholic?
Well, the short answer would be no. But I think I'd like to quote his friend Morris Baring, who in his letter of congratulations and welcoming to his good friend, he said, in my life, I can confidently say this is the one decision I have never regretted." But Chesterton in the Catholic Church Conversion talks about how he could never go back after this, could never go back, because it would be giving up his freedom to keep that image going that Dermot was talking about.
Yeah, well, I think that's right. I mean, I'm sure he never regretted becoming a Catholic. Although Dale could speak about the sense in which he recognized that he had certain kind of religious obligations which he took seriously. But I mean, sometimes you see kind of descriptions of Chesterton lumbering out of bed because he has to get to mass and so on. None of which, of course, was a matter for regret, but he recognized that he was living in a new reality.
What did Chesterton think of those who converted from Catholicism to Protestantism?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and I'm sure Dale has things to say about that. But I would say two things. I would say that Chesterton was a very considerable polemicist, as we know, a very considerable defender of the Catholic faith. And Dale mentioned, some fairly sharp remarks that he makes about Luther in his book on Thomas Aquinas. So Chesterton, as I say, was in favor of the fighting form of Christianity. That being said, what strikes me about the spiritual journey that I've described is what I call this theology of welcome, this opening of the gates to everyone, and that kind of generosity of spirit, I think, kind of transferred to those whose spiritual journey might have gone in another direction. I mean, obviously, he's not proposing that people should convert from Catholicism to Protestantism. That's not part of the plan. But I suppose I think of a remark that Samuel Johnson made, and Johnson spoke about conversion and about people who convert from Protestantism to Catholicism, and he says, and it's a kind of an idea that is very much a Chestertonian idea in advance, and that is sort of moving from a smaller to a larger space, and that is how Samuel Johnson saw conversion to Catholicism, and in reverse, he said, and it's quite a striking phrase. He said, anybody who converts from Catholicism to Protestantism must suffer what he called laceration of mind, that it's a kind of injury to the mind, to, so to speak, go from this large space to this small space. So I think that's essentially how Chesterton would have have framed the response to anyone who moves from Catholicism to Protestantism. But I'll leave Dale to answer that as well, because
Well, I think everything you said was right, Dermot, but he does make a couple comments that I think add a little more light on this. He does say that most people who leave the Catholic Church leave in a bad mood, that's kind of the main motivation. He says very few leave over a really strong theological difference. It's usually something in their own life that he says in the book on conversions, I have more sympathy with a person who leaves the church for a love affair than one who leaves it for a long-winded German theory. and and so and I think he's arguing that most people don't. It's not the theology of the Catholic Church is satisfying. There's something else that in the person's own life that they're looking for that is not a theological issue.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I mean, kind of suggests to me something that came into my mind as you were speaking, earlier, and that is, when Chesterton said that his decision to convert was entirely rational, and of course, as you also said, that it's a combination of the emotional and the rational, but it is certainly rational, and I mean that's what, for example, Arnold Lunn said when he converted, that this was simply, a rational decision. And it kind of struck a chord with me because it reminded me of Newman's remark in The Grammar of Assent, where he says, and I think he's capable of being misunderstood here, that no one was ever a martyr for a syllogism. And I think that the way to understand that remark, no one was ever a martyr for syllogism, is not to say that syllogistic reasoning is improper or useless or nothing to do with conversion. But that, because obviously, this is, as Chesterton says, I mean, for him, it was an entirely rational thing. But it also has to be, as it were, an emotional commitment, a sort of jumping in with the whole person. And when Newman says that no one is ever a martyr for a syllogism, what he's talking about is kind of the motivations for martyrdom and not the motivations for conversion. And I mean, you have to be as it were, utterly committed in the totality of your being, heart and soul, body and mind, heart and spirit, to enter the church. And once that reception has happened, then really there is, as we say, no going back.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, which just arrived. Can you discuss how prophetic Chesterton was on what we see now in the world, our country and the world, on the current apostasy, immorality, godlessness at the present moment?
That's an easy one. I think we need we need another hour and a half on that one about how prophetic Chesterton is. I mean, that truly is an endless source of amazement that what Chesterton seems to be writing about 100 years ago that we are seeing right now. But I guess this gives me an opportunity to bring up another book that I just got finished doing, called The Story of the Family. If anything, he was prophetic about the attack on the family in our society, and how that was what was going to really be the most detrimental thing to the culture, that if the family falls apart, the entire society falls apart. And in virtually every aspect of the attacks that we're seeing on the family, from divorce to contraception to abortion to saying strange sexual practices, and to the pressure of the economic ideas, and the education system. Chesterton writes about all those things with great insight, and I think it's possibly the number one thing that he was right about, that you can gain a great perspective from reading what he wrote about those things.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, Dale, and that's why Chesterton is still read and read with huge enthusiasm. His style of writing may seem to some people to be slightly old-fashioned. I mean, he's very much a sort of Edwardian man of letters. Nobody writes quite like Chesterton these days. I mean, it's brilliantly paradoxical, of course, and witty and funny, but it's still a slightly old-fashioned form of writing. But the reason that he is read is precisely that he is the prophet of our times, and that's why we have a G.K. Chesterton Institute for Faith and Culture. That's why we have the Society of G.K. Chesterton, your own society. That's why we have any number of Chesterton societies throughout the world, because there is a recognition in this remarkable man that he offers both a diagnosis and a cure for our many, many modern ills.
Amen.
Well, as we come to our close, I would like to thank you both. I would like to, on behalf of the Chesterton Institute, I would like to thank our speakers, Dale, who has joined us today from Minneapolis, and to Dr. Quinn, who is joining us from our own Seton Hall University, and all of our guests who have joined us today for this conversation and for your interest in our work. In the next few days, we're going to send out a notice to everyone because this presentation has been recorded, and you will be able to enjoy it all over again, on video. So if we do not have your email, please write to us at chestertoninstitute@shu.edu, and we will be sure to send you the link. And before we come to an end, I also would like to share a couple of things. One of them is that our next issue of the Chesterton Review, which is volume 48, Fall Winter 2022, will be out in December, and it will be a special conversion issue. So you will get part of these presentations and many other wonderful articles and pieces. So that's something great to look forward to continue this conversion conversation. And also we invite you, if you're in the New Jersey area, South Orange, please mark your calendar. We have a next event next week, November the 2nd. It will be in person, and we hope to be able to record it as well. Will be a dramatic reading of Patriarch Column's The Land. Will be at Walsh Gallery on November 2nd at 7 o'clock. We hope that you can join us. So we invite you to continue to read Chesterton. We thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you the next time. Thank you.